The phone rang at exactly 7 in the morning, which was unusual. David had been restoring old musical instruments for the past 15 years, working out of his small workshop in Brooklyn. Most of his clients knew better than to call before 9. He wiped the wood varnish from his hands and picked up. "Is this David Richardson?" The instrument restorer. The voice on the other end sounded both excited and nervous. "Speaking," David replied, already curious. "My name is Catherine Morrison. I'm the head curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Historical Instruments. We have a situation that requires your expertise. How soon can you come to Manhattan?" David had worked with museums before, but never the Metropolitan. They had their own restoration team. For them to call an outside expert meant something significant was happening. "I can be there this afternoon," he said. "Perfect. Come to the east entrance. Ask for me directly. And David, what I'm about to show you stays confidential until we understand what we're dealing with." 3 hours later, David stood in the museum's private conservation lab, staring at something that made his heart race. Behind a glass partition sat a piano unlike anything he'd seen in modern times. The wood was dark with age, the craftsmanship extraordinary, and the design unmistakably ancient. "Is that—" David couldn't finish the sentence. "A Cristofori," Catherine confirmed. "Built in 1720. One of only 3 surviving pianos made by Bartolomeo Cristofori himself, the man who invented the piano." David had read about these instruments in textbooks, seen photographs, but never imagined he'd stand in front of one. The piano looked fragile yet dignified, like an elderly person carrying the wisdom of centuries. "Why am I here?" David asked. "You must have specialists who—" "We do," Catherine interrupted. "But 3 weeks ago, during a routine humidity check, one of our technicians noticed something odd. A small gap in the soundboard that shouldn't be there. Our team ran scans and found what appears to be a hidden compartment. We need someone with your specific skills to open it without damaging the instrument." David felt his palms sweat. Opening a 300-year-old piano was nerve-wracking enough. Doing it while searching for a hidden compartment? That was another level entirely. "What do you think is inside?" he asked. Catherine smiled. "That's what we're hoping you'll help us discover." They spent the next hour discussing the approach. David examined every inch of the piano, taking photographs, making notes, studying the construction methods. Cristofori had been a genius, but he'd also been practical. If he'd built a hidden compartment, there would be a logical way to access it. The soundboard was the heart of any piano, the wooden panel that amplified the strings' vibrations into music. This one was made of spruce, hand-carved and aged to a golden brown. David ran his fingers along the edges, feeling for inconsistencies. "There," he whispered. "Do you see this?" Catherine leaned closer. "What am I looking at?" "These tiny wooden pegs. They're decorative on most of the soundboard, but these 3 here, they're slightly different. See how they sit just a fraction higher?" Catherine nodded, pulling out a magnifying glass. "You're right. I've looked at this piano 100 times and never noticed." David reached for his toolkit, selecting the smallest wooden wedge he had. His hands were steady despite his racing pulse. Working on historical instruments had taught him patience. Rush and you could destroy something irreplaceable. He worked for 20 minutes, gently applying pressure to the pegs in different combinations. Nothing happened. He tried again, this time pressing them in sequence from left to right. A soft click echoed through the quiet room. "Did you hear that?" Catherine whispered. A small section of the soundboard, no larger than a paperback book, shifted slightly. David carefully lifted it, revealing a shallow compartment lined with aged velvet. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in silk that had once been cream-colored, but had faded to yellowish gray. "Oh my God," Catherine breathed. David's hands trembled as he reached for the bundle. It was lighter than expected, but he could feel something solid inside. He placed it on the examination table, and together they carefully unwrapped the ancient silk sheet music. Pages and pages of handwritten musical compositions, the paper brittle and brown with age. The ink had faded from black to a rusty brown, but the musical notes were still clearly visible. Each page was covered in careful handwriting, with notes running up and down the staff in complex patterns. "Are these—" David started. "I don't know," Catherine said, pulling on white conservation gloves. "But look at this." At the bottom of the first page, written in elegant script, were initials, BC. Below that, Italian words, per sempre nascosto, forever hidden, Catherine translated. My Italian isn't perfect, but I'm sure that's what it means. David counted the pages. 12 complete compositions, each several pages long. Some had notes written in the margins, technical observations about hammer weights and string tensions, the kind of notes only someone who built pianos would write. Catherine, David said slowly, what if BC stands for Bartolomeo Cristofori? The curator's eyes widened. You're suggesting the man who invented the piano also composed music for it? Secret music that he hid inside his own creation? Look at these margin notes. Whoever wrote this understood piano construction intimately, and the hiding place. It's built into the instrument's design, not added later but planned from the beginning. Catherine pulled out her phone, scrolling through photos. I have images of other documents from Cristofori's workshop. Letters, construction notes, receipts. Give me a moment. She compared the handwriting on the sheet music to photographs on her phone, zooming in and out. Her hands started shaking. David, this matches. The letter formation, the way he writes his musical notation, even the way he abbreviates certain Italian words. This is his handwriting. They stared at each other, then back at the fragile pages on the table. If this was real, they'd just discovered compositions by the father of the piano himself, music that had been hidden for 3 centuries. Why would he hide his own work? David wondered aloud. Catherine picked up one of the pages, studying the complex musical notation. I'm not a musician, but even I can see this is sophisticated. Maybe too sophisticated for his time? What if he wrote music that was too advanced, too experimental? In the early 1700s, the piano was barely accepted. Cristofori spent decades trying to convince musicians it was better than the harpsichord. What if he feared that radical compositions would doom his invention? David thought about that. It made a strange kind of sense. Create something revolutionary, but hide your most daring ideas because the world isn't ready. Trust that someday someone will find them when the time is right. We need to authenticate these, Catherine said. Paper analysis, ink testing, expert musicologists. This could take months, and if it's real? David asked. Catherine looked at the ancient piano, then at the sheet music, then back at David. If it's real, we've just found the lost voice of the man who changed music forever. We've found compositions that were meant to be played on this exact instrument, and somehow we need to figure out how to let the world hear them. David nodded, already thinking about what came next. The piano hadn't been played in decades. To perform these compositions, he'd need to restore it to playing condition without destroying its historical integrity. It would be the most challenging work of his career. But as he looked at those fragile pages of music, hidden for 300 years inside a masterpiece, he knew one thing for certain. This was why he'd spent 15 years learning to restore old instruments. For this exact moment, the adventure was just beginning. The next morning, David returned to the museum to find Catherine pacing outside the conservation lab. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her coffee cup looked like it had been refilled several times already. Couldn't sleep either, David asked. I kept thinking about those compositions. I called someone last night. She's driving up from Philadelphia right now. Dr. Helen Bryant, one of the best musicologists in the country. She specializes in Baroque-era music. David nodded. Good call. We need someone who can read these properly. They'd spent the previous evening carefully photographing each page of sheet music, documenting everything before they touched it further. The pages were now stored in acid-free folders, kept at precisely controlled temperature and humidity. Even breathing on them felt dangerous. Dr. Bryant arrived 2 hours later. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Catherine had warned David that Helen didn't waste time on pleasantries, and she proved it immediately. Show me, Helen said, setting down her briefcase. They led her to the examination table where the first composition lay under protective glass. Helen pulled on gloves, adjusted her glasses, and leaned in close. For 5 full minutes, she didn't speak. She just studied the notes, occasionally using a magnifying glass to examine details. Finally, she straightened up. This is extraordinary. Can you tell what it is? Catherine asked. It's a sonata, but not like any sonata I've seen from this period. The structure is correct for early 1700s composition, but the complexity... Helen trailed off, moving to the next page. Look at this passage here. These chord progressions wouldn't become common until Mozart's time, 50 years later. And this section? This kind of harmonic experimentation didn't appear in mainstream composition until the Romantic era. David felt goosebumps on his arms. So whoever wrote this was way ahead of their time. decades ahead, maybe a century. Helen moved to another page, her excitement growing. And look at these technical notes in the margins. Comments about hammer velocity, string resonance, damper timing. Whoever wrote this wasn't just composing music. They were exploring what this specific instrument could do, testing its limits. Catherine pulled out her phone again, showing Helen the comparison images of Cristofori's handwriting. What do you think? Could it be him? Helen spent 20 minutes comparing the writing styles, pulling out her own reference materials. She examined the way letters connected, the slant of the writing, the formation of musical symbols. When she finally looked up, her expression was serious. I can't make a definitive judgment on handwriting alone, but everything matches. The style, the ink color, even the way certain Italian abbreviations are written. If this isn't Cristofori, it's someone who knew him intimately and copied his writing style perfectly. Why would someone fake this? David asked. Exactly, Helen said. In 1720, nobody knew the piano would become important. Cristofori struggled his entire life to get musicians to take his invention seriously. There would be no reason to create elaborate forgeries of experimental compositions for an instrument most people considered inferior to the harpsichord. Catherine called in more experts over the next few days. A paper conservator named Robert Chen examined the pages under microscopes and special lighting. The paper was Italian, handmade, consistent with early 18th century production methods. The aging patterns were natural, not artificially created. The ink was iron gall, exactly what would have been used in that period. A handwriting analyst named Patricia Williams spent 2 full days comparing every letter, every flourish, every pen stroke. Her conclusion matched Helen's initial assessment. The handwriting belonged to the same person who had written dozens of authenticated Cristofori documents. But the real breakthrough came when Helen started translating the Italian notes written in the margins. She worked slowly, using reference books and occasionally consulting with an Italian linguistics professor by phone. David and Catherine watched as Helen's expression changed from curious to shocked. Listen to this, Helen said, pointing to a note beside a particularly complex musical passage. Cristofori wrote, "This harmony frightens me. It is beautiful but dangerous. Like showing a child the ocean before teaching them to swim." Catherine leaned closer. What does that mean? Keep listening, Helen continued, moving to another page. Here he writes, I have created an instrument that can speak emotions the harpsichord cannot touch. But if I show the world music that is too bold, too raw, they will reject both the composition and the instrument. Better to hide these experiments and let my pianoforte prove itself with simpler songs. The room went quiet. David felt like they were reading someone's private diary, their deepest fears and struggles. Helen found more notes scattered throughout the compositions. On another page, Cristofori had written, Perhaps in 100 years or 200 musicians will be ready for this. Perhaps someone will find these melodies when the world has learned to hear them. He knew, Catherine whispered. He knew his music was ahead of its time, so he deliberately hid it. David thought about the clever compartment built into the piano soundboard. Not hastily added, but designed from the beginning. Cristofori had planned this from the start. He'd built a time capsule into his masterpiece. Helen spent the next week analyzing all 12 compositions. She recorded detailed notes about each piece, identifying techniques and musical ideas that wouldn't appear in popular music for decades or even centuries. Some passages reminded her of Beethoven's dramatic style. Others had the kind of harmonic complexity that wouldn't emerge until Debussy explored Impressionism in the late 1800s. This changes everything we thought we knew about Cristofori, Helen explained during one of their many meetings. History remembers him as an inventor, a craftsman. His pianos were engineering marvels, but most musicologists assumed he wasn't particularly interested in composition. This proves he was both an inventor and an artist. He understood music at a profound level. But understanding the music created a new problem. These compositions had been written for the specific piano where they'd been hidden. The notes referenced that instrument's unique qualities, its particular sound and feel. To truly hear what Cristofori had created, they would need to play the music on that exact piano. Has anyone played it recently? Helen asked. Catherine shook her head. Not in 40 years. It's too valuable, too fragile. We keep it as a display piece, a historical artifact. But it was meant to be played, David said quietly. Cristofori didn't build it to sit behind glass. He built it to make music. The three of them stood around the ancient instrument looking at it with new eyes. It wasn't just a museum piece anymore. It was an unheard voice waiting 3 centuries to speak. Could you restore it? Catherine asked David. Make it playable without destroying its historical value? David walked around the piano slowly, examining it from every angle. The wooden frame was stable but delicate. The strings were corroded and would need replacement. The hammers were worn down to almost nothing. The action mechanism, the complex system that turned key presses into hammer strikes, would need complete rebuilding. It would take months, David said, maybe half a year. I'd need to use period-appropriate materials, follow 18th century construction methods. Every replacement part would have to be handmade using the same techniques Cristofori used. But is it possible? Helen pressed. David looked at the sheet music, then back at the piano. He thought about Cristofori, alone in his workshop 300 years ago, writing music he believed the world wasn't ready to hear. Trusting that someday someone would care enough to listen. Yes, David said. It's possible. It'll be the hardest restoration I've ever attempted, but it's possible. Catherine made the decision that same afternoon. The museum board would need to approve it, but she was confident they would. This wasn't just about playing an old piano. This was about completing a conversation that had been interrupted for 3 centuries. There's one more thing we need, Helen said. A pianist. Someone who specializes in historical performance, who understands how musicians played in Cristofori's time. Someone good enough to do justice to compositions this complex. I know someone, Catherine said. Her name is Vittoria Romano. She performs on historical instruments all over Europe. If anyone can play these pieces the way Cristofori imagined them, it's her. That night, David stood alone in the conservation lab, looking at the piano and the dim security lighting. Tomorrow he would begin the most important work of his career. He would bring this instrument back to life and, in doing so, give voice to a genius who had been silent for 300 years. The real work was about to begin. Vittoria Romano arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in March. David watched from the conservation lab window as she stepped out of a taxi, holding a violin case close to her chest to shield it from the weather. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe in her mid-30s, with dark curly hair that the rain had turned into wild spirals. Catherine met her at the door, and minutes later they were all gathered around the examination table, where the compositions lay protected under glass. Victoria didn't say anything at first. She just stared at the pages, her eyes moving rapidly across the musical notation. May I? She asked, gesturing toward the first page. Catherine nodded, and Victoria pulled on conservation gloves. She lifted the page carefully, bringing it closer to study. Her lips moved silently as she read the notes, her fingers twitching slightly as if playing an invisible keyboard. After 10 minutes, she set the page down and looked at them with an expression David couldn't quite read. Shock, maybe. Or disbelief. This is impossible, Victoria said quietly. What do you mean? Helen asked. I mean, this music shouldn't exist. Not in 1720. Victoria pointed to a section of notes. Look at this modulation. This shift from major to minor within the same phrase. Composers didn't write like this for another 50 years. And hear these sustained bass notes under moving treble passages? That's a technique that requires the piano's damper pedal. But the damper pedal wasn't invented until decades after Cristofori died. David felt his stomach drop. Are you saying it's not authentic? No, that's not what I'm saying at all. Victoria picked up another page. I'm saying Cristofori was imagining music that his own instrument couldn't fully play yet. He was hearing sounds in his head that wouldn't be possible until other inventors improved on his design. Catherine leaned against the table. So he was composing for a future piano? One that didn't exist yet. Exactly, Victoria said. It's like he could see where his invention would go, what it would become. And he wrote music for that future instrument, even though he knew he'd never hear it played properly. Helen pulled out her notebook, flipping through her translations of Cristofori's margin notes. That explains something he wrote here. Listen, I hear this passage with a sustaining effect, as if the player could hold the low notes while the melody dances above. My instrument cannot yet achieve this dream, but perhaps one day it will. The room fell silent except for the rain tapping against the windows. David thought about what it must have been like for Cristofori, hearing music in his mind that he couldn't bring into the world, building an instrument that was revolutionary but not quite complete. knowing that his vision would only be realized by future generations. There's something else, Victoria said, moving to the third composition. These pieces tell a story, not with words but with music. Each one explores a different emotion, a different aspect of the human experience. This first one feels like wonder, like seeing something beautiful for the first time. The second is more troubled, uncertain. By the time you reach the later compositions, there's wisdom there. Acceptance. A musical diary, Helen murmured. He wasn't just experimenting with technique. He was documenting his inner life, Victoria nodded. And he was doing it in a way that only someone in the future could fully understand. Someone who knew what the piano would become. Over the next few days, Victoria worked with Helen to analyze each composition in detail. They discovered patterns and connections that went deeper than anyone had initially realized. Cristofori had organized the 12 pieces in a specific sequence, each one building on the previous. Together, they formed something like a musical autobiography. The breakthrough in understanding came when Helen was working late one evening, comparing the dates on various Cristofori documents with the likely timeline of when these compositions were written. She called David and Catherine back to the museum at 10 o'clock at night. "I think I know why he hid these," Helen said, spreading papers across the table. "Look at the timeline. Cristofori built his first piano around 1700. He spent the next 20 years trying to convince musicians and patrons that it was worthwhile. He faced constant rejection. People said the piano was too loud, too hard to control, not elegant enough. Some called it a noisemaker. I've read about that," Catherine said. "He struggled his whole life to gain acceptance." "Right, now look at these compositions. Based on the paper type and ink aging, our conservator estimates they were written between 1715 and 1720. That's when Cristofori was facing his harshest criticism, when it looked like the piano might be forgotten entirely. Victoria picked up the thread, so he created these pieces during his darkest period, when the world was rejecting his life's work. But he didn't just write simple pieces to prove the piano's worth, Helen continued. He wrote complex, emotionally powerful music that pushed boundaries. Music that would have scared away the very people he was trying to convince. David understood now. He was caught between two worlds. He wanted to show what the piano could truly do, but he knew that if he revealed music this radical, it would only make things worse. "So he made a choice," Catherine said softly. "He hid his heart to save his creation." Helen found more evidence to support this theory. In letters from 1718, Cristofori wrote to a friend about feeling torn between his artistic vision and practical reality. In another letter from 1719, he mentioned working on compositions for my own satisfaction, which shall remain private. He knew he was right about the piano, Victoria said. He knew it would eventually change music forever. But he also knew he wouldn't live to see it. So he left these pieces as a message, proof that he understood his invention's potential, even if no one else did. Catherine pulled out one of the photographs they'd taken of the hidden compartment, and he built the hiding place into the piano itself. It's not just a random spot. It's directly beneath the soundboard, the heart of the instrument. Symbolically, he put his heart inside his creation. David had been studying the construction of the compartment for weeks, and Catherine was right. The space was carved with the same precision and care as the rest of the piano. It wasn't an afterthought. It was part of the design from the beginning. "Here's what I think happened," Helen said, organizing her notes. Cristofori spent years perfecting the piano mechanically. But emotionally, spiritually, he needed to express what the instrument meant to him. So he composed these pieces in private, music that was too advanced, too personal to share with a world that didn't understand. And then he sealed them inside, Victoria added, with a message in Italian that says, "Forever hidden." Not because he wanted them lost, but because he knew they could only be understood in the future. When the piano had evolved, when musicians had caught up to his vision, "It's heartbreaking," Catherine said, "to create something so beautiful and know you have to hide it." David thought about all the hours he'd spent studying this piano. Every joint, every piece of wood, every carefully crafted detail. Cristofori had built it knowing it was imperfect, knowing it would need improvement. But he'd built it anyway, with love and precision, trusting that someone would continue his work. "There's one more thing," Victoria said quietly. She was holding the final composition, the 12th piece. "I've been studying this last one. It's different from the others, calmer, more resolved. And at the very end, There's a passage that sounds like a door opening, like he's inviting someone in. She hummed a few bars of the melody. It was simple but profound, like a question waiting for an answer. He was writing to us, Victoria said, to whoever would find these. He was saying goodbye, but also hello. Passing the torch, Helen wiped her eyes. Catherine did too. David found himself fighting unexpected emotion. They were strangers separated by 3 centuries from a man they'd never meet, and yet somehow they knew him. Through his music, through his careful notes, through his incredible act of faith, Cristofori had reached across time. We have to play these, Victoria said firmly, not just for history, not just for musicology, but for him, to complete what he started, to tell him that his message was received. David looked at the ancient piano in the corner of the lab. He'd been studying it, planning the restoration, but now he understood the weight of what they were attempting. This wasn't just about fixing an old instrument. It was about giving voice to someone who had been silenced by circumstance, by time, by fear of rejection. Then let's do it right, David said. Let's bring this piano back to life. David started the restoration on a Monday morning in April. The museum had cleared an entire section of the conservation lab for him, and he'd brought in equipment from his workshop. But as he stood looking at the 300-year-old piano, he felt something close to fear. "You're allowed to be nervous," Catherine said from behind him. She'd been watching him stare at the instrument for 10 minutes. "I've restored dozens of historical pieces," David said. "But this is different. If I make one wrong move, I could destroy something irreplaceable. That's why we chose you. You understand what's at stake." David nodded and picked up his first tool, a soft brush for removing surface dust. He would start with the simplest tasks and work his way up to the more complex repairs, slow and careful. That was the only way. The first week was just documentation. David photographed every inch of the piano from dozens of angles. He measured every dimension, noted every crack and worn surface, recorded every detail. He created a complete map of the instrument's current condition, so he could reference it throughout the restoration. The strings were the first major issue. They were made of iron, hand-forged 3 centuries ago, and most had corroded beyond repair. David needed replacements, but he couldn't just order piano strings from a supplier. He needed strings made the way Cristofori would have made them. He found a metallurgist in Pennsylvania named Thomas Webb, who specialized in historical ironwork. Thomas had recreated everything from medieval swords to colonial-era tools. When David explained the project, Thomas was immediately interested. "I'll need to research the iron composition from that period," Thomas said during their first phone call. "The impurities, the carbon content, even the forging temperature. Everything affects how the string resonates." "How long will it take?" David asked. "To get it right?" 3 months, maybe 4. "I'll need to make test batches and analyze them. We only get one shot at this." While Thomas worked on the strings, David focused on the piano's wooden frame. He found cracks that needed stabilizing, joints that had loosened over time, areas where humidity had caused slight warping. Each repair required period-appropriate techniques and materials. He couldn't use modern wood glue. Instead, he had to make hide glue from animal collagen, the same type Cristofori would have used. The smell was terrible, but it was the only way to ensure the repairs would be historically accurate. "Why does it matter so much?" asked Kevin, one of the museum's younger conservators who often watched David work. "Wouldn't modern glue be stronger?" "Stronger, yes, but wrong," David explained, carefully heating the hide glue over a small burner. "Historical instruments need to be repaired with materials that expand and contract at the same rate as the original components. Modern adhesives are too rigid. They'd cause stress points that could lead to worse damage down the road." Kevin nodded, making notes. He'd been assigned to document the entire restoration process for the museum's archives. The hammers were David's biggest challenge. In a piano, hammers strike the strings to create sound. The original hammers had worn down to almost nothing after centuries. David needed to rebuild them, but the felt used in modern piano hammers didn't exist in Cristofori's time. He spent 2 weeks researching before he found the answer. Early piano makers had used leather, layered and compressed to create different densities. David contacted a leather worker in Florence, Italy, a city not far from where Cristofori had lived and worked. The leather worker, Antonio, was in his 70s and had learned traditional techniques from his father. When David explained what he needed, Antonio laughed. "My grandfather told me stories about making leather for musical instruments. I never thought I'd actually do it myself. Send me the specifications. I'll create samples. Samples arrived 3 weeks later. David tested each one, gently tapping them against metal rods to hear how they sounded. Most were too hard or too soft. One was close but not quite right. He called Antonio with notes, and Antonio sent new samples. This back and forth continued for 6 weeks. Catherine checked in regularly, trying not to show her impatience. The museum board was excited about the project but wanted to announce it publicly. They couldn't do that until David was confident the piano would actually play. How much longer? Catherine asked one afternoon in July. David was working on the action mechanism, the complex system of levers and springs that connected the keys to the hammers. 2 months, maybe 3. This can't be rushed, I know. The board knows. But there's pressure to show progress. Tell them to come watch, David said. Not to touch, just to observe. Let them see how delicate this is. 3 board members came the following week. David showed them a single hammer mechanism he'd been rebuilding. The piece was no larger than a wallet, but it contained 7 separate wooden components, 3 springs, and 4 leather pads. Each piece had to move in perfect coordination with the others, and each piece had to be made by hand using 18th century tools and techniques. How many of these does the piano have? One board member asked. 54, David said. 1 for each key. And each one is slightly different because Cristofori adjusted them individually to create even tone across the instrument. The board members left with a new appreciation for the work's complexity. After that, the pressure eased. By September, Thomas had perfected the string formula. The first test string arrived wrapped in protective cloth. David installed it carefully, tuned it to pitch, and struck it with one of his rebuilt hammers. The sound that emerged was unlike anything a modern piano produced. It was softer, warmer, with a quick decay that felt intimate. Victoria happened to be visiting that day. When she heard the note, she closed her eyes. "That's it," she whispered. That's what Cristofori heard in his mind. David installed the remaining strings over the next 3 weeks. Each one had to be precisely measured, carefully positioned, and gradually brought up to tension. Too much tension too quickly could crack the wooden frame. Too little and the piano wouldn't have proper tone. Helen came by regularly to check on progress. She'd been studying the compositions continuously, making notes about dynamics and phrasing, trying to understand how Cristofori intended the pieces to be performed. "I keep finding new details," Helen said one day, sitting with Catherine in the observation area. In the 4th composition, he writes, "Play this passage as if remembering something sweet but distant." The man was 300 years ahead of his time in how he thought about musical expression. By October, David was working on the final details. The keyboard needed to be cleaned and adjusted. The pedals, which had been added to the piano decades after Cristofori's death, were removed to return the instrument to its original configuration. The soundboard was carefully treated with a mixture of oils that would preserve the wood while allowing it to vibrate freely. The museum scheduled a test playing for late November. Just the core team would attend. David, Catherine, Helen, Victoria, and a few key museum staff members. If the piano worked, if it could handle the stress of being played, they'd schedule a larger performance in the new year. David barely slept the week before the test. He kept thinking of things that could go wrong. A string might snap. The soundboard might crack. A hammer might stick. 3 centuries was a long time for wood and metal to stay silent. Asking them to sing again felt like tempting fate. The night before the test, he stayed late in the lab doing a final inspection. Every string, every key, every moving part. He'd done everything he could think of to prepare the instrument. Now he just had to trust his work. Catherine found him sitting in front of the piano at midnight. "You should go home and rest," she said gently. "I keep thinking about Cristofori," David admitted. "He built this with his own hands, spent years perfecting it, and tomorrow we're going to ask it to do something it hasn't done in decades. What if I've missed something? What if I've damaged it somehow?"
Catherine sat down beside him.
"You've treated this instrument with more care and respect than anyone could ask for. You've honored Cristofori's work by using his methods, his materials, his philosophy. Whatever happens tomorrow, you've done everything right." David looked at the piano in the dim light. It looked good, he had to admit. The wood had a soft glow from the treatment oils. The keys were clean and level. The strings were properly tensioned and aligned. By every measure he could think of, the restoration was complete. "Tomorrow we find out if history wants to speak again," David said quietly. Catherine smiled. Something tells me it does. Cristofori didn't hide those compositions to keep them silent forever. He hid them until someone cared enough to listen. And we care, David nodded. She was right. This wasn't about perfection. It was about connection, about reaching across time to complete something that had been left unfinished. About giving voice to someone who'd been silenced not by choice but by circumstance. Tomorrow, after 300 years of silence, Cristofori's lost melodies would finally be heard. And David had done everything in his power to make sure they sounded exactly as the composer had imagined them. The restoration was complete. Now came the moment of truth. The morning of the test performance arrived gray and cold. David got to the museum 2 hours early, even though there was nothing left to do. The piano sat in the center of the conservation lab, surrounded by chairs for the small audience. 40 people would witness this moment. 40 people would be the first in 3 centuries to hear Cristofori's hidden compositions. Victoria arrived next, carrying her shoulder bag and looking pale. "I didn't sleep," she admitted to David. "I kept running through the pieces in my mind." "Nervous?" David asked. "Terrified," Victoria said. "Not just about playing, about whether I can do justice to what Cristofori intended. These pieces were hidden for 300 years. What if I get them wrong?" Helen overheard as she walked in. "You won't get them wrong. You've studied these compositions for months. You understand them better than anyone alive." Catherine was the last of their core team to arrive. She'd been dealing with museum administration all morning, finalizing details for the recording equipment they'd set up. Everything would be documented. Audio, video, photographs. This moment needed to be preserved. The invited guests began arriving at 6 in the evening. Musicologists from universities up and down the East Coast, piano historians, conservation experts, a few journalists who'd been sworn to secrecy until the museum made an official announcement. They took their seats quietly, the air thick with anticipation. David stood near the back, his heart pounding. He'd checked every string one more time that afternoon, tested every key. Everything was as ready as it could be. But 300 years of silence was about to end, and he couldn't shake his nervousness. Catherine stepped to the front of the room. "Thank you all for coming. What you're about to witness is extraordinary. 6 months ago, we discovered 12 original compositions hidden inside this 1720 Cristofori piano. We believe they were written by Bartolomeo Cristofori himself, and sealed away because he felt the world wasn't ready for them." She paused, letting that sink in. Several people in the audience leaned forward. "David, Richardson spent the last 7 months restoring this piano, using only period-appropriate materials and techniques. Dr. Helen Bryant has studied and translated Cristofori's notes, and Victoria Romano has prepared to perform these pieces for the first time since they were composed. Tonight, we complete a conversation that began 3 centuries ago." The room was absolutely silent. Catherine stepped aside and Victoria walked to the piano. She sat down slowly, adjusting the bench, placing her hands over the keys without touching them. David could see her taking deep breaths, centering herself. Then she looked back at the audience. "Before I begin, I want to say something. These compositions aren't just music. They're a message from someone who felt deeply but couldn't share those feelings openly. Cristofori was asking future musicians to understand him, to hear what he heard in his imagination. I'll do my best to honor that." Victoria turned back to the piano. Her hand settled on the keys. For a moment, nothing happened. The room held its breath. Then she pressed the first note. The sound that emerged was unlike any piano David had heard before. It was softer than a modern instrument, more delicate but incredibly clear. The note seemed to hang in the air, intimate and vulnerable. Victoria's fingers moved to the next notes, and a melody began to unfold. The first composition was the one Cristofori had marked as wonder. The music started simple, almost childlike, then grew more complex as it progressed. Victoria's hands moved across the keyboard with careful precision, drawing out phrases that seemed to ask questions, reaching for something just beyond grasp. David found tears forming in his eyes. The piano was working. More than working. It was singing. Every string he'd installed, every hammer he'd rebuilt, every adjustment he'd made, was contributing to something beautiful. Something that had waited 300 years to exist. Around the room, others were crying too. Helen had her hand over her mouth. Catherine's eyes glistened in the soft light. Even the journalists who'd come expecting a historical curiosity looked moved by what they were hearing. Victoria finished the first piece and moved immediately into the second. This one was darker, more troubled. The melody twisted and turned, exploring minor keys and unexpected harmonies. David could hear what Victoria had meant about the music being ahead of its time. This didn't sound like early 1700s composition. It sounded modern, emotional, raw. By the fourth composition, everyone in the room understood they were witnessing something profound. This wasn't just historical curiosity. This was art that transcended time. Cristofori had poured his heart into these pieces, and somehow, across 3 centuries, that emotion was reaching them clearly. Victoria played for nearly an hour, performing all 12 compositions in the sequence Cristofori had intended. Each piece revealed new dimensions of his personality: joy and sadness, hope and despair, wonder and acceptance. It was like watching someone's entire emotional life unfold through sound. The final composition was the one Victoria had described as a door opening. It started quietly, almost hesitantly, then built to a series of cascading notes that felt like light streaming into darkness. The last phrase was simple and pure, ending on a major chord that seemed to say, "I trust you understood." When Victoria lifted her hands from the keys, silence filled the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They were all processing what they'd just experienced. Then someone started clapping. Others joined. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding, many people rising to their feet. Victoria stood and turned to face them, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't crying from the applause. She was crying from the weight of what she'd just done. She'd given voice to someone who'd been silent for 300 years. David felt overwhelmed. The piano had held up perfectly. Not a single string had broken. Not one hammer had stuck. The instrument had performed exactly as Cristofori had designed it to, bringing his hidden compositions to life with clarity and grace. After the performance, people crowded around the piano, though security kept them from touching it. Musicologists discussed what they'd heard, debating techniques and influences. Journalists asked questions, though Catherine reminded them they couldn't publish anything until the official announcement. Helen pulled David aside. "You did it. You brought history back to life." "We all did," David said. "You translated his words. Victoria played his music. Catherine made it all possible." "But you gave him his voice back," Helen insisted. "Without the piano working, those compositions would have stayed silent. You completed what Cristofori started." In the following weeks, the museum made the official announcement. The story went viral. News outlets around the world covered the discovery of the lost Cristofori compositions. Victoria was invited to perform them at concert halls across Europe and America. She recorded an album that became unexpectedly popular, reaching audiences far beyond classical music circles. David received calls from museums around the world, all wanting him to examine their historical instruments. Were there more hidden compartments? More secret messages waiting to be found? He checked dozens of instruments over the next year, but found nothing. The Cristofori piano's secret had been unique. The compositions themselves sparked new interest in Cristofori's work and in the early history of the piano. Music schools added them to their curriculum. Pianists, young and old, began learning them. The music that Cristofori had feared was too advanced for his time found an eager audience 300 years later. Helen published a book about the discovery, exploring Cristofori's life and work in new depth. She included translations of all his margin notes, giving readers insight into his creative process and emotional struggles. The book won awards and introduced Cristofori to a whole new generation, as not just an inventor, but an artist. For David, the experience changed how he saw his work. He'd always known restoration was important, but now he understood it was about more than preserving objects. It was about preserving voices, stories, human connections that transcended time. 6 months after the performance, David returned to the museum to check on the piano. It had been played several more times for recordings and small performances. He ran his usual diagnostics, checking string tension and hammer alignment. Everything looked good. The piano had survived its return to active use. It would need regular maintenance, but it was stable. Cristofori had built it to last, and with proper care it would continue making music for generations to come. As David packed his tools, he noticed the compartment where the compositions had been hidden. It was empty now, its secret revealed, but somehow it didn't feel empty. It felt like it had completed its purpose. Cristofori had hidden his heart inside his masterpiece, trusting that someone would eventually find it. He'd made a bet on the future, on the kindness of strangers he'd never meet, on the possibility that his message would matter to someone, somewhere, someday. He'd been right. His message had mattered. It had traveled 3 centuries to reach people who understood not just the music, but the courage it took to create it. The loneliness of being ahead of your time, the hope that your work might outlive you and speak to future generations. David closed his tool case and took one last look at the piano. It wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was a